This video looks at cost volume profit analysis, which is also referred to as break-even analysis. This can be an extremely important concept, particularly in situations such as that created by the COVID-19 pandemic. When businesses were closed during the lockdown, many still incurred fixed costs, such as rent, even though they were not generating revenue. Once they could reopen, often on a restricted basis, a key question became, what level of business do we need to generate the revenue and profit to cover the fixed costs? In other words, they were looking for the break-even point. Let's look at what the terms mean. Cost volume profit analysis includes the analysis of sales price, fixed costs, variable costs, the number of goods sold, and how it affects the profit of the business. The break-even point is reached when the total revenue exactly matches the total costs and the business is not making a profit or a loss. If the firm can sell at a production level above this point, it will be making a profit. So we can see that in a COVID-19 situation, businesses need to know the level of business they need to achieve in order to cover the fixed costs. We will look at establishing the break-even point using a graphical method and also using a formula. To keep things simple, we'll undertake the analysis using a single product. We will also highlight a few limitations of the break-even analysis and how you can manage the break-even point downwards to a lower level of activity. Let's build up the graphical method. Firstly, we will establish the axes. The vertical axis represents the monetary value, and the horizontal axis represents the volume of activity or output. Now we can plot the level of fixed costs. Fixed costs are costs that do not vary with the level of output and are fixed for a given period of time. A typical example is rent. This will be incurred even if no output is produced. Now let's plot the variable costs. Variable costs do exactly that. They vary with the level of output and represent the cost of producing one extra unit. As each unit costs the same to produce, the cost line rises in a linear pattern as output increases. A typical example would be the cost of materials. This also produces a total cost line, as we have added the variable costs on top of the fixed costs. This indicates that the total costs at any given level of output equals the fixed costs plus the variable costs. Now let's add the revenue line. This begins at point 0 and again rises in a straight line as each unit sells for the same price. We can see that the sales revenue line cuts the total cost line as the number of units sold increases. If we drop a line from the point at which the revenue line cuts the total cost line, it indicates the level where the business makes neither a loss nor a profit. This is called the break-even point. We can see that on the left of the line, the revenue does not cover the total costs and therefore makes a loss. But once the total costs are covered, the business begins to generate a profit. One other concept we can identify using the graph is the margin of safety. Let's assume that the output line extends to the anticipated level of output that we think we can sell. The difference between the expected demand and the break-even point is known as the margin of safety. Now let's look at the formula method. If the selling price is the same for each product, and let's assume it's $10, and the variable costs are the same for each product, say $5, then each product we sell makes a contribution towards the fixed costs and profit of $5. Thinking of the contribution as the contribution towards fixed costs and profit becomes significant later in this video. The simple formula is fixed costs divided by the contribution per unit which equals the break-even volume. Let's suppose our fixed costs are $500 and the contribution we calculated was $5 per unit. Our break-even point would be 100 units. We can test this with a simple profit and loss account. The sales revenue would be $1,000, our variable costs would be $500, the contribution would therefore be $500, and deducting the fixed costs of $500 leaves us with no profit or loss. In other words, we break even. This can be quite a powerful tool, as we can use it to calculate the level of output and sales required to make a given level of profit. For example, let's assume that we want to make a profit of $1,000. Remember, the contribution is the contribution towards fixed costs and profit, so we can substitute this into our equation. The calculation is now fixed costs of $500 plus the $1,000 planned profit divided by the contribution per unit, i.e. our $5, which means we need to sell 300 products to make our planned profit. And again, we can prove this via a simple profit and loss account. If we take the sales, less the variable costs, less the fixed costs, it leaves us with our planned profit of $1,000. Using the formula, we can also calculate the margin of safety. If we assume that the expected demand is in fact our 300 units, taking the difference between the expected demand and the break-even volume gives us a margin of safety of 200 units, and we can express this as a percentage of the expected demand. This means we can be 66% wrong in our expectations and still break even, that is, at least we'll cover our costs. Although break-even analysis is a useful tool, there are some limitations that should be noted. It assumes that the split between variable costs and fixed costs is relatively easy to ascertain. Some costs have fixed and variable elements, and therefore it is not always possible to put a high degree of accuracy on the fixed costs, but to apply a best estimate. It is possible to use statistical analysis to ascertain the level of variable and fixed costs. By plotting the level of costs incurred for different levels of activity over a time, we can draw a line of best fit, or use regression analysis. Where it cuts the vertical axes gives an indication of the level of the fixed costs, and the slope of the line would indicate the variable element. The analysis assumes that fixed costs remain constant over the volume range considered. If there is a rise in fixed costs at a given output due to stepped fixed costs, for example having to rent an additional room, there may be a loss incurred until a second level of output is reached that covers the additional fixed costs. Break-even charts in their simple form only deal with one product at a time. However, in our restaurant example, we could use the average spend per customer as a guide for revenue and variable costs. Often businesses will have a typical mix of sales that means it is possible to use an average revenue and variable cost per level of activity. For example, we'd be asking the question, how many diners or customers do we need to break even? Let's close this video by looking at a few things we could do to reduce the level of activity at which break-even is achieved. We could try and increase the contribution made on each sale. This could be achieved by adjusting the selling price, but here we need to be careful of the sensitivity of customers to the price and also the reaction of competitors. We could also try and reduce the variable costs. For example, in a restaurant situation, moving towards less expensive ingredients or making subtle changes to the menu items. One aspect that could have an effect here is more careful portion control, that is, reducing the size of portions, which means lower costs per meal. We could also try and promote the higher margin sales to change the sales mix and increase the contribution by that means. In our restaurant situation, this could also be done alongside a more careful management of the ingredients. We could also look for additional sales opportunities that do not increase the fixed costs. Many restaurants began to offer takeaway meals to generate lost revenue. For example, one restaurant in the city of Bristol in the United Kingdom, as well as offering takeaway meals, began making and selling pies in collaboration with a local butcher, and the same restaurant began selling wine online, all without increasing its fixed costs. Of course, an obvious choice might be to try and reduce the fixed costs, for example, negotiating a lower rent, or sadly, as has happened with the COVID-19 pandemic, reducing the level of staff on full-time employment contracts. Other videos and resources can be found at my website at managementaccountingandstrategy.com. The website promotes management accounting in support of strategy.